Right now, somewhere in the world, a paramedic is radioing ahead to an ER. A police officer is calling for backup. A child is pressing a button on a toy walkie-talkie and hearing a stranger's voice crackle back. All of it, every last signal, traces a direct line to one man, and almost nobody knows his name. Al Gross, born 1918, died 2000, estate value at death, roughly $26,000. He was 11 years old the first time he built a radio, not a kit, not a toy. He wound his own coils, soldered his own joints, and pulled signals out of the air in his bedroom in Cleveland. By the time he was 16, he held an amateur radio operator's license. By 21, he had conceived of something that had never existed on Earth, a portable, handheld device that could transmit and receive voice communications over radio waves without a base station, without a switchboard, without a wire touching the ground. A two-way radio you could carry in one hand and talk into like a conversation across a room, except the room was a battlefield, a city block, the open sky. What kind of mind does that? The kind that doesn't see what exists, only what's missing. Gross grew up in an era when wireless communication meant a telegraph operator tapping Morse code, or a massive broadcasting tower bolted to the earth. The idea that a human being could walk freely and speak wirelessly, in real-time voice-to-voice, was to most engineers a fantasy. Frequency allocation, battery size, antenna efficiency, receiver sensitivity. Every single one of those problems had to be solved simultaneously, in miniature, by a young man working largely alone. He solved them, and when he was done, he filed for a patent. The year was 1938. Al Gross was 20 years old. The device he patented wasn't called a walkie-talkie yet. That name came later, coined by journalists who needed a catchy shorthand. What Gross built was, at its core, the first practical two-way portable radio transceiver, a machine that could both send and receive voice signals without external infrastructure. To understand why this was revolutionary, you have to understand what the world looked like without it. Military units in the field communicated through wire. Literal copper wire, strung across terrain, through mud, over hills into forward positions. When the wire was cut, by shellfire, by weather, by enemy action, the communication died. You were blind. You were isolated. You made decisions without information and people died for it. Every general, every tactician, every soldier on the ground understood this fragility. The wire was the throat of the army, and the enemy always knew where to cut it. Gross's device eliminated the wire entirely. Suddenly, a squad leader could speak to battalion command from inside a forest. A forward observer could call in artillery coordinates while lying in a ditch. A pilot could coordinate with infantry on the ground in real time. The tactical implications weren't just significant, they were civilization-altering. Military historians have argued, with genuine credibility, that portable radio communication shortened the Second World War. That is not hyperbole, that is consequence. But here's where the story begins to turn. In 1941, with the United States about to enter the war, Al Gross brought his invention to the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, predecessor to the CIA. They recognized immediately what they had. The device was classified, not just adopted, classified, which meant that Gross himself was now legally prohibited from discussing, demonstrating, licensing, or publicly documenting his own invention. The government had effectively silenced the inventor of the walkie-talkie. And while he was silenced, his patent clock was running. In the 1940s, a US patent had a lifespan of 17 years from the date of grant. The OSS took Gross's technology, stamped it classified, put it in the hands of agents and soldiers, and sent him to work developing it further, all under secrecy orders. He couldn't go to manufacturers. He couldn't license the technology. He couldn't even publicly claim credit for having made it. The war lasted 4 years off a 17-year clock. 4 years during which Motorola and other manufacturers were studying military radio equipment, learning from it, reverse engineering its principles. Let that sink in slowly. The government classified his work, used his work, and the classification itself became the mechanism by which his legal protection eroded. When the war ended and the classification was lifted, Gross finally had the freedom to commercialize his invention. He formed a company. He pursued licensing deals. He tried to do what every inventor is supposed to be able to do, profit from the thing he made. And for a brief moment, it looked like it might work. The Citizens Band radio service was established in part because of Gross's advocacy. He licensed his patents to a small number of manufacturers. He received some royalties, not enormous sums, but real acknowledgement, a real claim. But Motorola didn't license from him. They didn't need to, or more precisely, they calculated they didn't need to. Motorola had spent the war years as a military contractor, manufacturing the SCR-300 backpack radio and the SCR-536 handy-talkie. These were wartime production items built under government contract, and the government, not any private inventor, held much of the associated IP in the military's view of things. When the war ended, Motorola took that manufacturing expertise, that government relationship, and that accumulated radio engineering knowledge directly into the consumer and commercial market. They were already a giant. They had factories, distribution, lobbying power, and the accumulated legitimacy of having supplied the U.S. Army. Al Gross had patents, and a patent is only as powerful as your ability to enforce it. Enforcement means lawyers, lawyers mean money, and patent litigation in the mid-20th century was not a game that a solo inventor with modest resources could play against a company with Motorola's legal budget. So Gross watched. He watched his patents approach their expiration dates. He watched the technology he invented proliferate across police departments, construction sites, taxi dispatchers, and factory floors, in devices manufactured by companies that had paid him nothing or next to nothing. He watched the walkie-talkie become one of the defining communication tools of the 20th century. And then his patents expired. Once a patent expires, anyone can use that technology freely forever. There's no appeals process, no retroactive compensation. The window closes. What had been Gross's exclusive legal claim simply ceased to exist, and what he was left with was the undeniable historical fact of invention and almost no money to show for it. If the story ended there, it would be a tragedy of circumstance. Bad timing, wartime complications, the cruelties of a patent system that was never designed for inventors operating under government secrecy orders. But the story doesn't end there, because Al Gross didn't just invent the walkie-talkie. In the late 1940s, he invented the pager. He called it the Belby, a small one-way radio receiver. You wore it on your person, and when someone transmitted a signal to it, it alerted you. No voice, no message, just a tone. But that tone meant someone needs to reach you, go to a phone. It was the first personal wireless alert system. He demonstrated it. He tried to license it. The telephone companies weren't interested. The idea of people being reachable away from a fixed line was, to the executives at those companies, a solution to a problem they didn't think existed. He invented the cordless phone in the 1960s. Again, years, in some cases decades, before the commercial products that made those categories into multi-billion-dollar industries. He held patents. He pursued licenses. And again, the gap between what he created and what he captured was almost total. By the time the pager became a ubiquitous piece of medical and professional life in the 1980s, doctors clipping them to their belts, drug dealers and real estate agents treating them as indispensable tools. The patents Gross held were either expired or had been developed into products by companies that had paid him, at best, licensing fees that a major corporation would count as rounding errors. In the final decades of his life, Al Gross was occasionally rediscovered by journalists looking for a good story. He was generous with those interviews. He was funny, sharply, precisely funny, in the way that people sometimes become when the alternative is despair. He joked that he wasn't even worth a patent filing fee. That line got quoted a lot. People smiled at it and moved on and picked up their cell phones. What didn't get quoted as often was what the joke actually meant. Filing a patent in the United States in the 1990s cost, depending on the application, somewhere between a few hundred and a few $1,000s. Al Gross, the man who had invented the foundational technology beneath portable wireless communication, said he couldn't afford it. That wasn't self-pity. That was a precise, factual statement about what the system had done to him. He died on December 21, 2000, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, which feels like the kind of detail a novelist would invent. He left behind an estate valued at roughly $26,000. At the moment of his death, the global market for pagers was measured in billions. Cell phones, devices that are, in their foundational logic, direct descendants of the wireless communication principles he pioneered, were in the pockets of hundreds of millions of people. Motorola, by then, was one of the most valuable telecommunications companies on Earth. There is no villain in this story who twirled a mustache. Nobody broke into Al Gross's lab and stole blueprints in the night. What happened to him was more systemic and, in some ways, more disturbing than outright theft. A government that needed his technology classified it without protecting him. A patent system that was theoretically his only shield turned out to have a 17-year expiration date that wartime secrecy quietly devoured. A market full of manufacturers and telecommunications companies made rational, legal decisions that were legal precisely because the protections had run out and paid him nothing. That is how genius gets consumed in a system optimized for scale, not through crime, through timing, classification, legal attrition, and the simple fact that large organizations have legal departments and inventors mostly don't. The question that stays with you once you know this story is not really about Al Gross. He was, by every account, a man who loved the work, who built radios at 11, who kept building and inventing until his body wouldn't let him, who seemed to find in the act of creation something that the lack of financial reward couldn't entirely extinguish. The question is about the system. About what a society signals, about value, about fairness, about whose contributions count, when it allows this to happen not once, not as an anomaly, but as a recognizable pattern. Nikola Tesla died penniless. Philo Farnsworth, who invented television, spent his last years in near obscurity, while RCA built a broadcasting empire on principles he'd established. Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography work formed the basis of Watson and Crick's Nobel Prize-winning DNA model, and she died without receiving the award. The names of the credited and the names of the actual inventors do not always match. In fact, they match far less often than the history books suggest. Al Gross invented the walkie-talkie. He invented the pager. He invented the cordless phone. These are not contested claims. They are documented, patent-backed, historically verifiable facts. The technology he created is embedded in the infrastructure of modern life so completely that imagining its absence requires a genuine effort of imagination. No emergency services communication, no wireless coordination of any kind, none of the casual, instant connectivity we treat as ordinary. He got $26,000. Not as a settlement, not as a consolation payment. That was simply what he had accumulated over an entire lifetime of genius-level contribution to human civilization. There is something important in sitting with that number for a moment instead of rushing past it. $26,000, the price of a modest used car, less than 1 year of median household income, the net sum of a life that made billions possible for others. If you've ever pressed a button and spoken to someone who wasn't in the room, if you've ever been paged, ever carried a cordless handset from room to room, ever clipped a radio to your belt, then in a very real and non-metaphorical sense, you are living in a world that Al Gross built. He built it as a teenager in Cleveland. He built it through a world war, through classification orders, through corporate indifference, through the slow erosion of legal protections that were never designed to protect someone in his position. He built it anyway, and the world used it without ever learning his name. That's not an accident. That's a pattern worth recognizing, because somewhere right now there is another inventor working alone, working without the resources to defend what they've made, working in a system that will classify, absorb, or outlast them if they're not careful, building something that will change everything. The question is whether we've learned anything since Cleveland, 1929, when a boy wound coils in his bedroom and pulled the future out of thin air.